At dawn on a frozen December morning, a county road crew found a car nosed into reeds beside the Pearl River. Its lights dead, frost sealing doors, paperwork scattered by wind, and the quiet suggesting time had stopped long before anyone arrived to notice the air held breath without answers. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The car belonged to 22-year-old Emily Harper, a junior at a small Mississippi college, last seen 2 nights earlier when holiday traffic thickened and Christmas lights blinked on storefronts across Rankin County. The discovery set a procedural chain into motion that felt familiar to older men who had watched decades of local news. A radio call, a taped perimeter, photographs taken before footprints blurred, and a deputy leafing through registration under gray light. Emily's name was written in careful block letters on the incident log, the ink already smudging from cold fingers. The initial assessment avoided conclusions. There were no obvious signs of a crash. The riverbank showed no skid marks. The keys were missing. Her purse lay on the passenger seat, cash intact. Receipts from holiday shopping dated the previous afternoon. The car's clock had stopped at 9:14 p.m., a minor detail logged and forgotten for years. Emily Harper had grown up 10 miles away, the daughter of a paper mill electrician and a church secretary. She was home for the season, balancing finals with shifts at a department store where older shoppers asked for help choosing gifts. Missing person flyers would soon carry her photograph to gas stations and courthouse bulletin boards, printed on beige paper that curled at the edges. On December 18th, her parents reported her overdue after she failed to arrive for a family supper. Officers canvassed roads between campus and home, noting weather conditions and traffic advisories. A winter front had moved through, bringing rain that turned to sleet after sunset. By the time the car was found, the rain had washed away whatever fragile traces might have existed along the shoulder. The medical examiner was notified after divers searched the river downstream, a standard measure that yielded nothing. When Emily's body was located 2 days later in a wooded drainage area half a mile from the car, the response remained measured. There was no spectacle, only the careful work of documentation under bare trees strung with frost. The autopsy would later note hypothermia and blunt force injuries consistent with a fall, with time of death estimated late evening on December 16th. The report avoided speculation, listing findings and exclusions, noting the absence of alcohol and the presence of minor defensive abrasions that could not be conclusively interpreted. For the men who read such reports, the language carried weight precisely because it refused drama. Investigators reconstructed a timeline anchored to receipts, time cards, and witness statements. Emily had left her store shift at 8:42 p.m., purchased gasoline at a station on Highway 25, and called her mother from a pay phone to say she was on her way. A clerk remembered a young woman in a red coat asking for directions to avoid traffic near the river bridge. Another witness reported a light-colored pickup idling near the shoulder around the same time, though the description varied with each retelling. The case file thickened with handwritten notes, Polaroids, and maps marked in pencil. As Christmas approached, the town pressed on with parades and services, while the investigation slowed under holiday staffing and the limits of 1984 forensics. Local newspapers covered the story with restraint. Headlines mentioned a missing student, then a recovered body, then an ongoing investigation. Editorials urged caution on rural roads during winter storms. The sheriff held briefings that emphasized cooperation and patience. For older residents, the cadence was familiar, recalling other winters when tragedies interrupted routine. By New Year's Day, tips dwindled. The pickup lead went nowhere. The car yielded fibers that matched Emily's clothing and nothing else. Without clear suspects, The case drifted toward dormancy, filed under unsolved, revisited periodically when manpower allowed. Years passed. The evidence boxes moved from active shelves to cold storage, their labels fading. Emily's parents aged, attending hearings on funding for cold cases, writing letters when new technologies appeared in the news. Thanksgiving seasons came and went, each one reopening the absence at the table. In the courthouse basement, a new generation of deputies learned the layout of old files, guided by veterans who remembered when the Pearl River froze thin and the county still relied on film. The break would not come quickly or cleanly. In the late 1990s, a review of unsolved cases flagged Emily Harper's file for re-examination. Advances in fiber analysis and the establishment of DNA databases offered cautious optimism. The original autopsy samples were located, preserved according to the standards of the time. A lab request was filed, the chain of custody re-verified. Investigators retraced the timeline with fresh eyes, questioning assumptions shaped by an earlier era. Weather data was pulled to reassess hypothermia estimates. Traffic patterns were reconstructed using archived transportation reports. The pickup sightings were mapped against known vehicle registrations from 1984, a tedious task that eliminated dozens. A small but significant detail emerged from the gasoline receipt, a partial license number scribbled by a clerk, initially dismissed as unreliable. Cross-referenced with regional registrations, it narrowed the field to 3 vehicles. One belonged to a local contractor, Thomas Reed, then 36, whose work routes placed him near the river that night. Reed had moved counties in 1986, a common occurrence that explained earlier oversight. His record showed no violent crimes, only minor citations. When contacted, he cooperated, providing an alibi that relied on memory rather than documentation. Samples were collected lawfully and compared. The result was inconclusive, not a match, not an exclusion. The investigation continued quietly, method by method. Old interviews were retyped, discrepancies noted. A witness who had reported the pickup was re-interviewed, now older, more cautious, but clearer about a dent on the rear panel. Vehicle inspection records revealed Reed's truck had undergone bodywork in early 1985. Receipts placed him near the river again that winter. None of it was sufficient alone. For men accustomed to the slow grind of cases, the patience required was understood. In 2008, a renewed push funded by a state grant allowed retesting with more sensitive techniques. This time, trace material recovered from Emily's coat yielded a partial profile. When run through updated databases, it indicated a familial connection. Investigators followed the lawful process, identifying a relative of Reed who had been arrested years later for an unrelated offense and whose DNA was on file. A warrant was obtained. Reed was interviewed again, his statements compared against decades of records. The contradictions were subtle but consistent, timelines shifting around holidays, memories aligning too neatly with public events. By the time the case reached a grand jury, the narrative had hardened into something verifiable. Evidence linked Reed to the scene through fibers, opportunity, and now DNA consistent with transfer. The prosecution outlined a scenario supported by records rather than conjecture. An encounter on a dark road during a winter storm, an attempt to help that turned coercive, a struggle leading to Emily leaving the car and succumbing to exposure and injury. The defense challenged the age of the evidence and the absence of witnesses. The jury deliberated with the seriousness such cases demand. When the verdict came decades after that frozen morning, it was delivered without flourish. Thomas Reed was convicted of manslaughter, the sentence reflecting the statutes in place at the time of the offense. In the quiet aftermath, Emily Harper's parents issued a brief statement expressing relief that the questions had answers. The town noted the resolution with a short article placed below holiday announcements. The courthouse returned the file to storage, now marked solved, a word that never restores but sometimes steadies. The conviction did not end the examination of how a small Mississippi community had carried an unanswered loss through seasons that repeated with ritual certainty. For men who had watched the decades pass, the case offered a study in procedure, endurance, and the slow alignment of facts. Investigators documented their post-verdict review, noting which assumptions from 1984 had misled early efforts and which steps, though routine, proved essential later. The winter weather that first week had been logged without emphasis, yet later analysis showed how sleet erased impressions and shortened visibility, a reminder that environment shapes evidence as much as intent. Records showed that the initial search radius had been conservative, guided by manpower limits during Christmas leave. When the radius expanded years later using terrain analysis, it explained why Emily Harper's path from the car to the drainage area had remained unnoticed. The methodical mapping of elevation and cover, common now, was not standard then. Older deputies acknowledged this without defensiveness, framing it as context rather than error. The case file preserved those acknowledgments in ink. The autopsy, re-examined line by line, gained clarity with time. Hypothermia had been correctly identified, but the sequence of injuries took on meaning once the timeline tightened. Blunt force indicators aligned with a fall down a short embankment, consistent with uneven footing near the riverbank. The absence of intoxicants supported the theory of a sudden encounter rather than impaired driving. The findings remained restrained, their power lying in accumulation rather than flourish. Witness interviews, long considered exhausted, yielded incremental value when revisited with contemporary standards. Memory degrades, but patterns persist. The clerk's notation of a partial plate, once discounted, gained credibility when matched to the contractor's route logs. A retired trooper recalled a call about a light truck parked without hazard lights near the bridge, an entry buried in dispatch rolls from that night. These fragments, individually modest, assembled into a framework sturdy enough for scrutiny. The seasonal setting mattered. December traffic diverted drivers from familiar roads, concentrating movement near the river crossing. Holiday errands extended into darkness, increasing vulnerability. Thanksgiving had just passed, and Christmas shopping pressed schedules late. Investigators emphasized these factors to explain why Emily Harper accepted assistance from a stranger, a choice many would have made under similar conditions. The narrative resisted judgment, focusing instead on circumstance. As the case progressed toward trial, the prosecution adhered to a narrow theory supported by documentation. There was no attempt to inflate motive or dramatize character. Thomas Reed's employment records placed him nearby, his vehicle repairs explained by receipts timed closely after the incident, and the DNA linkage met statutory thresholds. Chain of custody was established with care, acknowledging the age of the samples and the safeguards applied at each transfer. Experts testified to probabilities without absolutes, a tone consistent with the evidence. Media coverage mirrored the restraint. Local papers framed the arrest as a product of persistence rather than revelation. Photographs showed courthouse steps under bare trees, a visual echo of the winter when the case began. Editorials noted advances in forensic science while cautioning against retrospective certainty. For an older readership, the coverage felt familiar, grounded, and sober. During sentencing, impact statements were brief and factual. Emily Harper's life was summarized through records rather than recollection, a choice that maintained the documentary tone. The court acknowledged the passage of time, weighing accountability against the reality of decades elapsed. The sentence reflected the law applicable in 1984, a point clarified to avoid misunderstanding. Appeals were anticipated and prepared for with comprehensive documentation. The aftermath unfolded quietly. The sheriff's office updated its cold case protocols, integrating terrain modeling and expanded witness review timelines. Training materials referenced the case without nomming it, emphasizing process over outcome. The evidence room reorganized archival storage, digitizing indices to prevent future obscurity. These administrative steps lacked drama but carried meaning for professionals attuned to prevention. For the Harper family, closure arrived without ceremony. Emily's parents attended a memorial service near the river during a mild December, wreaths set against brown water moving steadily south. They spoke with investigators about the practical lessons learned, expressing appreciation for diligence rather than triumph. The exchange was recorded in a supplemental report, its language formal and spare. Community memory adjusted gradually. The missing person flyers had long since yellowed, but the resolution reframed them as markers of persistence. Older residents discussed the case in terms of roads and weather, the way men often do when translating loss into geography. Younger residents encountered it as history, a reminder of vulnerabilities that accompany seasonal routines. The legal record closed with final motions denied and appeals resolved. Thomas Reed entered custody to serve his sentence, his name joining others in the state registry, unremarked beyond the paperwork. The court clerk filed the last order on a gray afternoon, stamping the date with practiced force. Outside, holiday decorations returned to storefronts, indifferent to case numbers. In the cold archive, Emily Harper's file now bore a red notation indicating resolution. Inside, the documents remained unchanged, preserving the chronology from discovery to verdict. For investigators, the file became a reference point, cited when discussing the value of incremental work and the risks of assumption. For families still waiting, it stood as evidence that time does not erase obligation. The town continued its cycles. Thanksgiving dinners passed, Christmas lights came down, New Year calendars flipped. Roads were resurfaced near the river, guardrails replaced, signage improved. None of these changes altered the past, but they shaped the present in modest ways. The case's conclusion did not promise safety, only clarity. For a generation that measures stories by their adherence to fact, the Mississippi 1984 case offered a lesson in restraint. The truth emerged not through confession or spectacle, but through patient alignment of records, science, and context. It honored the discipline of investigation and the dignity of those affected. In that sense, the resolution belonged not to a single winter, but to the many seasons that demanded persistence until answers were earned. In reviewing the procedural lessons, supervisors emphasized documentation discipline during holidays, when staffing thins and assumptions multiply. Logs from 1984 showed gaps typical of the era, not negligence, but reminders that continuity matters most when routines are disrupted by weather and celebration. Updated policies now require redundant recording of roadside encounters and expanded canvassing when seasonal traffic patterns change. The reforms did not assign blame. They translated experience into safeguards. Training sessions referenced river crossings, drainage corridors, and rural shoulders as recurring risk points during winter storms, reinforcing the importance of lighting checks, reflective gear, and early coordination with transportation agencies. The case also reshaped relationships with laboratories. Contracts now specify long-term storage protocols and periodic audits of biological samples. Chain of custody forms include legacy fields to capture historical transfers, reducing ambiguity decades later. Analysts who testified noted how partial profiles, once unusable, gain value as databases grow. The lesson was not technological optimism, but stewardship, preserving what cannot yet be interpreted. Investigators learned to ask what future tools might require, and to protect evidence accordingly. Community outreach evolved as well. Rather than dramatic appeals, departments invested in steady communication with local press, explaining process milestones without predictions. This approach, tested during the Harper case's reopening, maintained trust across age groups accustomed to careful reporting. Flyers shifted from reactive pleas to standardized information sheets archived digitally, ensuring accuracy over time. The aim was continuity, not urgency, a tone that aligns with measured audiences. Finally, the review acknowledged the human cost of waiting. Policies now include scheduled family briefings, even when no progress exists, to prevent silence from compounding loss. These meetings are documented, factual, and brief, respecting boundaries while affirming commitment. The Harper family's experience informed these guidelines, demonstrating how restraint can coexist with compassion. The system cannot restore what was lost, but it can promise diligence. In quiet rooms and cold archives, that promise is the work itself. As winter returns each year, investigators note how similar conditions recur, testing preparedness. The Harper case is cited during seasonal briefings as a reminder to slow down conclusions when nights lengthen and surfaces glaze. Attention to mundane details such as stopped clocks, misplaced keys, and receipts dampened by rain can later anchor timelines. The discipline of noticing, recording, and revisiting remains central. Resolution arrived because those habits endured beyond headlines and holidays, carried forward by professionals who accepted that answers, when they come, arrive quietly. The record stands complete, not as a tale of inevitability, but as a ledger of choices made carefully over time. It remains a reference for those who value method over myth and patience over noise, especially when seasons tempt haste. Such cases close, finally, by returning to order without celebration. That quiet is the measure many professionals respect most. It marks completion, nothing more, and it leaves the calendar free to turn, unburdened by unanswered questions at last. For those who waited, that mattered. It always does eventually. Quietly so. The third phase of the documentary turns from verdict to verification, tracing how conclusions were tested against records rather than sentiment. Investigators compiled a post-conviction chronology, aligning warrants, lab reports, and court filings to ensure internal consistency. The exercise mattered for credibility, particularly for audiences accustomed to procedural accountability. Every date was rechecked against holidays, weather advisories, and staffing rosters, eliminating ambiguities introduced by seasonal disruptions. The aim was not vindication, but assurance that the record would withstand future scrutiny without embellishment, conjecture, or omission, reflecting a culture shaped by patience and restraint over decades of institutional memory and practice. The review addressed early assumptions surrounding consent and assistance, common themes in wintertime roadside encounters. Analysts compared contemporaneous safety messaging with the choices documented that night, noting how norms influenced behavior before cellular ubiquity. Emily Harper's acceptance of help aligned with period expectations, not recklessness. This framing mattered legally, narrowing theories to provable acts rather than character judgments. It also clarified training implications for modern officers facing similar conditions during holiday congestion and adverse weather. The file captured these notes as guidance, not critique, preserving professional humility across generational transitions within Mississippi law enforcement agencies statewide today. Consistency remained central. Attention then shifted to the evidentiary bridge between opportunity and causation, an area scrutinized carefully at trial. Vehicle movement analysis combined fuel receipts, maintenance invoices, and route histories to place Thomas Reed within a defined window near the river. Analysts emphasized margins of error, accounting for traffic delays and storm effects. This conservative modeling strengthened reliability, preventing overreach. Fiber transfer findings were contextualized with laundering cycles and storage conditions, reflecting best practices. The cumulative presentation favored corroboration over novelty, a principle familiar to seasoned observers. It underscored method as the guarantor of fairness and accuracy over time, always, precisely, documented. The DNA component warranted careful explanation to avoid misunderstanding. Experts clarified partial profiles, transfer mechanisms, and statistical weight without absolutes. The familial link narrowed inquiry lawfully, triggering warrants supported by probable cause. Documentation showed how consent and collection complied with standards applicable at each stage. Chain integrity was audited, gaps addressed, and lab controls reviewed. For an audience mindful of courtroom rigor, this transparency reinforced trust. The narrative resisted claims of inevitability, presenting probability bounded by caution. That balance preserved legitimacy across appeals, audits, and later reviews conducted by independent authorities statewide and beyond, ultimately accepted by the court record. Procedural fairness extended to defense considerations. Motions challenging age of evidence and recollection reliability were answered with citations and precedent. The court evaluated prejudice claims in light of corroboration breadth, finding safeguards adequate. This assessment mattered to observers who value due process as much as outcome. Sentencing analysis acknowledged statutory constraints from 1984, avoiding retroactive enhancement. The record reflected proportionality, aligning punishment with proven conduct. No extraneous allegations were entertained, maintaining focus. Such restraint resonated with communities wary of spectacle, reinforcing confidence in institutions tasked with balance and care under law always. Documented, clear, sober, careful, deliberate, measured, consistent, recorded. After judgment, administrative follow-through became the priority. Property inventories were reconciled, exhibits returned or retained per order, and evidence tracking systems updated. These steps prevented confusion and preserved auditability. Training memoranda distilled lessons without nomming individuals, focusing on process. Supervisors emphasized winter response protocols, roadside welfare checks, and early documentation during holidays. The aim was resilience when staffing thins and risks rise. Institutional memory was codified, reducing reliance on recollection alone. This shift reflected experience gained over decades, honoring victims through preparedness, not rhetoric. Files now open cleaner, sooner, and stay accessible longer. Quietly, consistently, statewide, adopted, enduring, practical, effective. Community response following resolution remained understated. Churches acknowledged the outcome in brief notices, and civic groups resumed routine agendas. There were no rallies or commemorations, only quiet recognition that uncertainty had ended. For older residents, the case joined a catalog of winters remembered by weather and roads. The Pearl River remained a reference point, its crossings improved since 1984. These material changes stood apart from the legal record, yet informed safety planning. Memory adjusted slowly, favoring facts over rumor. Local press archived coverage digitally, preserving tone and context. The story settled into history without distortion. That restraint endured, quietly, respectfully. For the Harper family, post-trial months involved administrative tasks rather than ceremony. Restitution filings, record corrections, and notification schedules were completed. They met with officials to review timelines, asking practical questions about storage and access. The exchanges were factual, measured, and brief. Emily Harper's name remained the focus, referenced consistently in documents. There were no public statements beyond acknowledgement. Privacy-guided decisions aligning with their preferences. Officials recorded feedback to improve family communications elsewhere. The process closed without spectacle, reflecting dignity. December passed quietly, then January. Seasons turned again. Stability returned gradually. That mattered. It always does. For families, enduringly. Within law enforcement, the case influenced mentorship. Veterans used it to teach juniors about restraint, documentation, and humility. The emphasis fell on recording minor details that later anchor reconstructions. Stopped clocks, missing keys, and weather logs were cited as examples. These habits outlast technologies, providing continuity. Training modules adopted the approach, emphasizing patience during holiday surges. The message avoided heroics, valuing steady work. Evaluations showed improved completeness in winter reports. Supervisors credited shared learning. The culture shifted subtly, sustainably. Over time, fewer gaps appeared. Consistency increased. Outcomes stabilized, that is success. It compounds, quietly, professionally, measured, reliable, durable, long-term, proven. The documentary's third movement also situates the case within Mississippi's broader archival effort. Counties collaborated to index cold cases, standardizing metadata for retrieval. Emily Harper's file benefited from these systems, enabling cross-county searches. The approach respected local control while improving visibility. Grants supported digitization without altering originals. This balance preserved evidentiary integrity. The narrative highlights cooperation as infrastructure, not publicity. Shared indices reduce duplication and delay. They serve families waiting, results accumulate slowly. Progress remains incremental, yet access improves. Accuracy rises, trust follows, the system strengthens, quietly, patiently, methodically across seasons. Years pass, work continues, steady. Unseen, essential, enduring, documented. Seasonal context returns as analysis, emphasizing how holidays complicate policing. Staffing gaps, altered routes, and weather hazards converge. The Harper case illustrated these pressures plainly. Updated checklists now trigger expanded canvases during winter storms. Coordination with transportation agencies accelerates response. These measures aim to reduce blind spots. The lesson is practical. Seasons shape outcomes. Planning counters chance. Documentation anchors memory when time stretches. That principle guided reforms. It remains central. Older professionals recognize it intuitively. Newer staff learn it formally. The bridge holds. Practice improves, outcomes stabilize, loss lessens, slightly. Over years, that matters, it counts, measured, real, sustained, earned. The film's packing mirrors the investigation's restraint. There is no rush to judgment, only accumulation. Viewers are invited to weigh documents as professionals would. This approach suits audiences accustomed to long arcs and earned conclusions. The Mississippi setting remains tangible, with roads, courthouses, and archives grounding events. Weather punctuates scenes without melodrama. The story advances through procedure. That choice respects viewers who value substance. It honors the record. The outcome stands on its merits. Nothing more is needed. The calm persuades, facts endure, seasons pass, truth remains, quietly, reliably, carefully, without noise, without excess, without fear, just work. Done properly. As the narrative approaches its close, attention returns to aftermath rather than climax. Court dockets finalize, supervision begins, and compliance is monitored. These steps lack spectacle but complete accountability. The Harper case did not end with headlines but with forms filed and calendars set. That closure aligns with the values emphasized. The system functioned belatedly yet lawfully. Communities observed quietly. Families adjusted. Professionals returned to work. The winter cycle resumed. Roads iced, lights blinked, routines held, memory softened, not erased, just steadied. That is closure here. Earned, measured, sober, complete, without flourish, without claims, just records, kept, answered, settled, finally. Looking forward, agencies track outcomes from reforms inspired partly by this case. Metrics show improved early documentation and faster cross-references. Winter incidents receive expanded canvases. Family contact schedules are maintained. None of this guarantees resolution, but it reduces loss. The Harper investigation demonstrates how diligence compounds. Over years, small steps matter. The lesson is transferable, grounded in practice. Professionals adopt it readily. Communities benefit, trust grows, patience is rewarded, not always, sometimes, enough to justify effort to honor victims, to steady systems. Winter returns, work continues, files remain, open, then close, properly, documented, reviewed, improved, repeated, enduring, quiet, lawful, true. The Mississippi 1984 case occupies a modest place in history, defined by restraint. Its resolution affirms that time need not defeat method. For those who have watched seasons turn, the lesson is clear. Persistence matters, documentation matters, law matters. Emily Harper's name endures in records now answered. The quiet that follows is earned. It closes the book, leaving the calendar free. Roads remain. Rivers move, winters pass, archives hold, work continues, cases await. This one rests, solved, verified, documented, without excess, without myth, just fact, quietly, respectfully, complete, enduring, true for all in time at last, here, now done fully. The closing movement of the documentary returns to fundamentals, reinforcing how the Mississippi 1984 case reached its lawful end without distortion. Investigators completed a final audit after all appeals were exhausted, a routine step intended to confirm that no procedural loose ends remained. Warrants, lab certifications, and custody logs were reviewed once more, then sealed. The file's completeness mattered less for publicity than for institutional confidence. It demonstrated that the system, though slow, had operated within bounds. For audiences familiar with bureaucratic rigor, this mattered. Closure was not emotional release but administrative certainty, the kind that allows organizations to move forward without doubt lingering in margins or footnotes. The legal aftermath unfolded predictably. Thomas Reed entered the correctional system under supervision protocols aligned with his sentence. Intake records reflected age, health status, and classification, details logged with the same neutrality found throughout the case. There were no extraordinary conditions, no special measures beyond standard compliance. Parole eligibility followed statute, not sentiment. Monitoring reports were filed on schedule. These mechanics, often overlooked, completed accountability. They ensured that the verdict translated into consequence, measured and lawful, without expansion or erosion. For observers who value order, this consistency affirmed the integrity of the process. Emily Harper's case also influenced archival practice beyond county lines. State coordinators incorporated its timeline into training materials illustrating longitudinal case management. The emphasis remained on continuity, preserving evidence, revisiting assumptions, and integrating new tools without compromising originals. Archivists standardized labels and metadata fields so that future reviews would not depend on institutional memory alone. This shift acknowledged turnover as inevitable and documentation as the safeguard. The Harper file, once nearly forgotten, now served as an example of recovery through organization rather than chance. Community institutions adapted quietly. Local colleges updated safety advisories for winter travel, referencing weather patterns and rural road conditions without invoking the case directly. Churches hosted informational sessions on roadside assistance norms, reflecting changes in technology and expectations since the 1980s. These efforts were practical, not reactive. They aimed to reduce vulnerability during holiday congestion when routine stretch and judgment is taxed. The Pearl River corridor received additional lighting and signage, improvements justified through traffic studies. The changes were incremental, their benefits cumulative. Media retrospectives appeared sparingly, timed around anniversaries but restrained in tone. Reporters relied on records rather than recollection, quoting filings and summarizing findings. Photographs showed infrastructure rather than faces, reinforcing the documentary sensibility. Readers responded with measured letters nodding appreciation for thoroughness. The absence of sensational framing aligned with community norms shaped by age and experience. The story's endurance came from accuracy, not repetition. For the Harper family, the years following resolution focused on normalization. Administrative closures freed time previously consumed by correspondence and updates. They requested certified copies of final orders, then disengaged from formal contact. Officials respected boundaries, nodding preferences in files to guide future interactions. The family's grief did not transform, but its edges softened without unanswered questions. Seasonal gatherings continued, now without the burden of uncertainty. This shift, subtle yet profound, marked the human end of the process. Within law enforcement, leadership evaluated metrics associated with reforms inspired by the case. Winter incident response times improved modestly. Documentation completeness increased. Cross-unit collaboration rose, particularly with transportation and emergency services. None of these outcomes promised prevention, but they reduced risk. Supervisors framed progress as maintenance rather than victory. The language mattered, keeping expectations grounded. The Harper case reinforced that improvements are iterative, sustained by attention rather than acclaim. The documentary's tone remains consistent to the end. There is no crescendo, only resolution. The Mississippi landscape persists as context. County roads, courthouse halls, storage rooms cooled to preserve paper and memory. Weather continues to punctuate routine, reminding viewers how conditions influence events. The narrative resists moralizing, instead tracing how systems respond to loss over time. That restraint suits an audience accustomed to evaluating outcomes through records and procedure. As calendars turn, the case's presence diminishes in daily conversation. It reappears during training sessions or archival audits, then recedes. This rhythm reflects healthy closure. Stories that linger too loudly risk distortion. Here, quiet serves accuracy. The finality rests in files marked complete, appeals resolved, and lessons absorbed. The work continues elsewhere, informed by what was learned. The Mississippi 1984 cold case solved story concludes not with celebration but with steadiness. Emily Harper's name remains recorded, now paired with answers. Thomas Reed's accountability proceeds within law. Institutions adjust, incrementally stronger. Communities adapt, modestly safer. The river flows, roads endure, winters return. The documentary ends where it began, grounded in place and process. The tension that once defined discovery gives way to order restored. For those who measure justice by diligence rather than drama, this ending satisfies. It affirms that patience, documentation, and lawful persistence can close even the oldest questions. The quiet afterward is not absence but resolution, earned over time and held in record.